Voor de webinar van deze maand blikken we nog een laatste keer terug op Hopfest bij Brouwland. Aangezien Joan Montassel nog een mooie presentatie voor ons heeft waarin hij alles vertelt over de interactie tussen hop en gist tijdens de fermentatie. Ook wel bekend als biotransformatie. De informatie in deze module sluit trouwens ontzettend goed aan bij de module fermentatie gevorderd. Mocht je deze webinar dus interessant vinden, zorg dan ook dat je die even bekijkt. Veel kijkplezier!
All right, happy Saturday, everyone. Thanks for joining us today in this session where we will talk about biotransformation, basically the yeast and hop interaction that occur in fermentation. So first of all, I would like to thank the invitation from Brouwland as well. I would like to thank Jo for all the support behind here. And I would like to present you in the next few minutes some of the main points regarding biotransformation, because as you possibly know, it's a quite complicated topic and a really hot topic these days. So hopefully you will enjoy this presentation, and please, if you have any questions during the presentation, leave any question in the chat, so I'll be more than happy to answer at the very end. Okay, so let's move on with the presentation. As mentioned, the title is quite obvious, biotransformation. So basically, we'll talk about yeast and hop interactions and everything that is occurring during fermentation and how we can benefit out of this presentation, okay? So as you know, what's going on nowadays, the current trends in the brewing industry, it's mostly about getting flavor, getting drinkability, getting all these tropical and citrusy-like flavors out of our beer. So that's why we have successful beer styles like New England IPAs. So this is what the market is actually demanding under the craft beer revolution. So in that sense, as I mentioned, so people is looking for consumers are looking for less bitterness. So it doesn't mean it's not well perceived. It just means that people prefer cleaner bitterness rather than the harsh bitterness. So how do we achieve better flavor, nicer flavors, and less bitterness, hence more drinkability? So what we have here is we can play under the brewing process. That means playing with pH, playing with the brewing liquor, so reducing sulfates and increasing chlorides. Then we can play, of course, with the hop varieties. We have plenty of hop varieties in the market. As you know, because it's an agronomic product, comes from the field, so every year is changing. So we have a consistent product, but still it changes from time to time. Also, it's not the same hop varieties that it's coming from Europe or from US. So the origin makes in person an effect here. Then another important factor to consider here is the yeast strain we select for our fermentation. So this is actually crucial because, brewers make the wort, but yeast at the end is the one who is making the beer, is making all the magic and changing from wort into beer. And what we will be discussing in this presentation is about a less known fact, which is biotransformation. So this could be considered a new approach to take into account and play with it, okay, during our brewing processes. So what's the meaning, the actual meaning for biotransformation? So biotransformation precedes a reaction that is occurring in nature. It's happening not only in brewing, but it's happening in many places, even in our organism are occurring, even in plants as well. But in terms of brewing, biotransformation is, let's say, the modification of a compound which is found in hops. This compound is called glycoside, as an example. And then we have enzymes that are being released through our brewing strains, that these enzymes are able to cleave and, cut down all these molecules from hops and release let's say, an aromatic compound. It can be terpenes, it can be thiols, or other substances. But the main conclusion of this is an interaction between two important raw materials in brewing, which is hops and yeast. So one of the main contributors of aroma coming from hops is not from the polyphenols, is not from the resins, is not from anything but from the hop oils. So hop oils is a substance found in hops, which is very tiny in concentration, but is the one that expresses the aroma. Okay. We will have a discussion later on that regards, but it's important to know that we have aroma compounds that are in free form. That means that we can, let's say, we can touch a hop pellet and rub it into our hands, and there we will be able to perceive all these thiols or terpenes in free form. But we have other aromatic compounds that are chemically bound, that are found and chemically bound in well, they are not perceived, they are just inner compounds. So these are the ones that we will find more interesting in this presentation. So if we have a deeper look into the families of hop oils, we can see three different families, three different fractions here. So on your left, you will see the hydrocarbon fraction. Here we can see terpenes or hop oils such as myrcene, which is described as piney. These guys are not really contributing into biotransformation. So the ones that are having a role in biotransformation are the one in the middle, which is the oxygenated fraction, and the one at the very right, which is the sulfur fraction. So sulfur fraction are more well, commonly known or heard in industry as thiols or polyfunctional thiols. So sulfur fraction can be perceived as not a good compound, but because of the sulfur name, but are better known as thiols. Okay. So if we take a look at the oxygenated fraction, so here we can find compounds like geraniol or even linalool, all these kind of oils that have this termination of OL, okay, at the very end. So as I mentioned before, we have these guys here in free form, but also in a binded form. So they are chemically attached to other compounds. Okay, so they are not perceived by the consumer as an aromatic compound per se. So in that case, we will need an enzyme which is called beta-glucosidase. You can see here on the top. So beta-glucosidase is an enzyme released by brewing yeast, which is able to release hop oils of that family. Okay, and on the other hand, we have another enzyme which is called beta-allease, and beta-allease is the responsible for releasing thiols, which can be found also in a binded form, in bound form. So what sort of interactions we can find between yeast and hop? Because it's not all about biotransformation. We have other interactions to take into account. So this is a communication from Professor Thomas Shellhammer from Oregon State University, and he described in one of his presentations at a craft beer conference different types of interactions between these two raw materials. So the very first one here, as you can see on the top, we have the stripping of volatiles. That means that we can have all these aromatic compounds in free form or in bound form, and they can be lost by stripping because of the CO2 production during fermentation, and they can be lost as well interacting with the yeast, actually with the cell membrane, and this phenomenon is called adsorption with D, not with B. So that makes it different because adsorption per se, the concept means that all these hop oils are, let's say, attached, or they are attached to the cell membrane of the yeast, and as soon as we remove the yeast from the tank, so we are also losing all these compounds from our beers. Another interaction we can see is the solubility. So that's mostly a physical effect. So as soon as our fermentation is going on, so we have, of course, an increase of ethanol content in our beer. So the more ethanol, the better solubility we have of these hop oils. Okay. Another factor here is aroma masking, and I can provide you an example for this so you will understand better. Let's say if we select a POF positive strain, let's say a Belgian type or German like strain, which is usually perceived as a yeast strain that is able to make phenolic flavors. So all these super aromatic compounds like phenols, they can interact by masking hop compounds. Okay, so this is important to bear in mind here. And last but not least is biotransformation that we will be discussing in the next slides. So putting the scope on biotransformation, we can see several reactions because it's not only one reaction between thiols or between glycosides. So the very first one we have is esterification. We can find ester production, all right, and the change of and the modification of certain compounds under the name of esterification. So this is one type of biotransformation we can see in fermentation. The other one is stripping compounds that we discussed already. So they can be lost or they can be changed during fermentation. Number three, we have the release of bound thiols. So I would like to emphasize this again. So we have thiols in free form that we can perceive in hop during dry hopping, for instance. But then we have these bound thiols that we need an enzyme from the yeast that will be released after all. Okay. And number four, we have a similar concept, which is bound glycosides. Okay, so that will be thanks to the beta glucosidase. So in this presentation, we will focus on two different reactions because we have several. So it will be the release of terpenes thanks to the beta glucosidase and the release of thiols thanks to the beta-lyase. So it's two different enzymes that we can find in yeast. Okay. So if we take a deeper look into the beta glucosidase activity from yeast, we at Lallemand, we have characterized all our portfolio. So you can see in this graph here, let's say a distribution of all our yeast strains from less to more enzyme activity in terms of beta glucosidase. Okay, so we can see, for instance, Phyllis Sour, which is a non-Saccharomyces yeast. It's named Lachensia. So this guy over here has less enzyme activity, whereas on the other side we have BRY97, which is a West Coast, ideal for American and IPAs and all sort of hoppy beers. So that makes total sense because it's super high in beta glucosidase compared to the others. Okay. And now if we put the beta-lyase enzyme activity here and we do the same characterization, so we can see again BRY97 the most with the most activity for beta glucosidase, as you can see in the blue bars in the blue color. And on the other hand, we have beta-lyase, which the most active one is one of our latest release, which is Brouwland IPA. So Brouwland is a really suitable strain for New England IPAs and all sort of hazy IPAs. So it's not only for the esters that the yeast strain is able to produce, it's also for the high enzyme activity for beta-lyase. Something I forgot to mention about thiols is that thiols can be really perceived at very, very low concentrations. So as soon as we are able to release tiny amounts of thiols through this enzyme activity. So this will be really perceived by the consumer. Okay. So far we have been discussing the enzyme activity coming from brewing yeast under fermentation, but then we have another solution that it makes well, it's quite worth to have a look, which is the use of exogenous enzyme in order to boost the enzyme activity. Okay, so it's not only using the brewing strains per se and their enzyme activity, but adding an extra support or extra help for boosting this enzyme activity. So here I share with you a paper from Thomas Schellhammer and his team in 2017. So these guys, they were testing, if you can see the bars here at the bottom at 10%, at that 10 bar. So you can see the difference between ale and ale strains with high and low beta glucosidase activity. So if you use exogenous enzymes, you will see that we can boost the enzyme activity up to 100%. So it can really be boosted by using such enzymes. So for that reason, we at Lallemand decided to do some investigation and some research in that regard. So we wanted to see if we're able to present to the market a product based on such exogenous enzymes in order to help the enzyme activity that is coming from yeast itself. Okay, so for that reason, we launched a product under the AB Vickers brand, which is called Aromazyme. So Aromazyme is an enzymatic preparation rich in beta-glucosidase, so it's able to release terpenes by hydrolyzing the glycoside bonds. Okay. So the main objective of this product will be to increase the diversity of hop aroma and flavors by releasing all these terpenes. And something that we found in some trials we did at global scale, that I'll show some of the results later on, but we found that by using these enzymes, we enhance the drinkability of the beers. So coming back to the first slides where I was mentioning that people and consumers are looking for more drinkable beer and less harsh, bitter beers. So that's really contributing positively in the final product. And last but not least, we found also that we can express more character from less sophisticated hop varieties. By less sophisticated hop varieties, I mean those varieties that are not so fancy in the market, because you know that people, well, brewers mostly are looking for heavy aromatic hop varieties. But we have in the market other hop varieties that are not that powerful, but they have a lot of precursors, a lot of thiols and terpene in bound form. So there are a lot of potential out there. So some of the sets of this Aromazyme product is in powder form, so that makes really concentrated and really easy to use. Because of that, it has a long shelf life, so it's not liquid, so it can stand over time. It has been characterized by brewing application, okay, because we know that there are other enzymatic preparations, but for wine or juice industries. So this one is really characterized for brewing, and it's derived. It's produced by a non-GMO fungi from Aspergillus strain. So in the next slides, I'll be presenting two of the many trials we did in the pre-launch of this product. So as you can see here, we did trials in several countries around the globe. So I'll be presenting one of the very first one that was done in Spain in a brewery called Napa Beer, and the other one in the UK in a brewery called Glenafric. So before doing any trials, we were discussing with the brewers if they were accepting to join us in this challenge. So this is some of the guidelines we provided to them. So we recommended the initial dosage for 5 grams per hecto. We also suggested them to use the enzyme at the start of fermentation. Most of them decided not to hydrate the powder, the enzyme, which makes total sense because it was used along with the yeast, so there was no need for hydration. But it's important to mention that if you can hydrate the powder, it's better to get an uneven dispersion, homogenization of the product. And some of the strains that brewers use are Lallemand strains like Beer 197, New England, or Nottingham, which are commonly used for IPA or hoppy beer styles. And in return, we asked the brewers to get a full recipe in order to understand all the parameters contributing there, as well as all the process details. Because biotransformation is not like a simple thing, a simple equation. It's quite complex. There are many, many factors imparting an effect. So as soon as we can collect many data from the recipe or from the process, the better for us to understand the complexity of the results. We also ask in return some of the samples for testing in terms of sensory and in terms of terpene concentration. So as you can see here in this picture on the right, so we asked the brewers to produce wort in the brew house in order to minimize variables. So this wort was then split into two different fermenters or fermentation vessels. That's why you can see here FB1 or FB2. So FB1 was control bites. That means fermented wort with no enzyme, only the enzymes from the yeast activity itself. And on the other hand, we had FB2, which was the same conditions, but with the addition of enzyme. So one of the very first trial, as mentioned, it's Napa Beer, located in north of Spain. So these guys, they brewed a brut IPA that was back in 2018, when brut IPA was a super trendy style. So for that recipe, they use a West Coast strain, beer 97, and they use 6 grams per hecto of beta-glucosidase, slightly higher than we recommended. So as following the guidelines, so they made one single board produced in the brew house and split it into 2 different fermenters. You can see the control as FB1 and BGL, which stands for beta-glucosidase, it was placed in FB2. I don't know if this will be clear to you, but I'll try to explain that as I can. But here is the analytical results we found from the lab. So you can see the table in the upper left part, the table of different hop oils that we measure. We can find oils from the hydrocarbon fraction as well as the oxygenated fraction. So the ones that are really contributing here will be the ones with an OL termination, like linalool and citronellol as well as geraniol. So very interestingly here, we can see that geraniol was increased by 300%. That means that the beer treated with enzyme was 3 more times rich in linalool. So that's really, really interesting to see. On the other hand, we had citronellol, which was increased by 77%, almost the double. And also very interesting here, we saw a decrease on geraniol by 18%. But overall, if we have a look on total terpenes, the blue bar here, as you can see in my mouse, blue bar stands for treated beer with exogenous enzyme. So you can see that it's really boosting the concentration of terpenes in the final beer. So it makes a clear difference here. So this graph in the bottom, placed in the bottom, is the same as found the numbers found in the table. As you can see, distribution here. So linalool is the one that is perceived as flower, lavender. So that one was perceived 3 more times. Then we had the citronellol, which is described as citrusy fruits, and then geraniol, where it was reduced by using enzymes, it was described as flower-like, or I don't know the name in English, geranials? Well, never mind, it's a flower-like flavor. So one of the theories we have to explain these results is this proposal from Takoi, a researcher from Japan. So he suggested this pathway back in 2017. So as you can see here, where it says glycosidically bound geranyl precursors. So this is the reaction that aromazyme is able to do. Okay, so go and find these precursors and breaking them down into geranyl or other hop oils. So in that sense, geranyl, as you can see here, can undergo to a series of complex reactions. So it can be transformed into citronellol, it can be transformed into linalool, and so on and so on. So that will be the possible reason why we found less geranyl in the enzyme treated beer, because we consider that this geranyl was converted not by aromazyme but by the yeast during fermentation into other different compounds here. Okay, and we think also that linalool was boosted because of the enzymatic activity from aromazyme. But again, this is all theories based on papers, on research. At this point, it's quite complex to track and try to understand all what is actually happening in a fermentation in terms of biotransformation. So following the results from Napa beer, as mentioned before, we can see a huge difference between terpenes found in the treated beer and with the control. We also found a slight increase on ester production. That could be explained by the glucose released, because if you let me go back just for a second, there's something really interesting here. When we break down a glycoside found in hops, we release a terpene, but we also release a glucose molecule. Okay, so this glucose will be slightly affecting the fermentation. You will see why. Glucose can have an impact on the ester production, but it also has an impact on the ethanol concentration. So as you can see here, the enzyme treated beer, this had a slightly increase on ethanol coming from the glucose release. That doesn't mean that you will have a super alcoholic beer at the very end. It just means that you can expect a slight increase by 0.2 or 0.3% of your beers. So if you are, for instance, planning to do let's say a non-alcoholic beer or low alcoholic beer and using aromazyme to increase the aroma, you have to take into account that you can see a slight increase by 0.2%, sorry, of ethanol. Okay, it's not a big difference, but of course it needs to be considered. So if we move to the sensory, we had two different panels here. We had a general panel, which was composed by people with no experience or background on sensory. Whereas on the other hand, we had an expert panel, which was composed by also 6 tasters with let's say some sort of training of flavors and flavors in beer. So more experienced. So the first panel, the general panel, which was composed by 6 tasters, we found that 4 out of 6 tasters preferred the beer with enzyme, which is the blue bar. Okay, so it makes a preference for enzyme treated beer. And if we move to the expert panel, we found that 5 of the 6 tasters prefer the beer with enzymes. So overall, we can see that beers that were treated with aromazyme, they were more preferred versus the control. And we asked the experienced tasters to do some scoring, and this is some of the parameters that they found. So that was very interesting to see here. The very first, if you can see, hoppy. So again, beer treated with enzyme was perceived as more hoppy versus the control. Unfortunately, at that time, we were not able to provide a score sheet with different hoppy flavors because hoppy, it's a quite ambiguous term. We should be better asking for fruity, tropical, citrusy, herbal, and so on. But we just asked for overall hoppiness. So anyways, it was considered more hoppy. Okay. Also very interesting here in the second group of columns, we can see bitterness. That doesn't mean that by transformation is providing any extra bitterness, but this could be also explained because of that was a brut IPA, so that means a super attenuated beer, and possibly the release of glucose that made even more attenuated beer. So that was affecting the bitterness perception to a certain extent. So that could be the explanation for this bitterness. This was not actually seen in other beer styles because it was perceived as not less bitter, but less harsh bitterness or more drinkable. Okay. And then for the other compounds, they were mostly quite the same. So the aromazyme was not really playing a role. We can see here, for instance, in case you saw this red bar, we found also some DMS, but this is not really explained for enzyme activity. That must be something else during handling or something that we think it's out of control here. So if we move on to another trial we did in this case in the UK, so that was Glenafric. So these guys, they did a more complex trial. So in that sense, they used a New England strain from Lallemand, and the beer style was a New England IPA. So these guys, they produced a batch of wort, and they split it into into 4 different fermentation vessels. So one was the control, no enzyme. The second one was the addition of enzyme, 5 grams per hecto, which was added at the start of fermentation. Number 3 was the same quantity of enzyme added at the start of fermentation, and at the start of fermentation, it was also added 25% of the dry hops. Okay. And the number 4, fermentation vessel number 4, it was the same quantity of enzyme plus, it was not added at the very start of fermentation. It was added at the day 4 of fermentation, also with 100% of dry hops. So let's see what's going on if we add enzymes and dry hops after fermentation. So as you can see, the total content of terpenes here in parts per billion. The blue bar is the control, the B1, as you can see here. And then if we see the enzymes added at the start of fermentation, we saw a slight increase on total terpenes, which is something really expected by using this enzymatic preparation. At fermentation vessel 3, we found something quite strange. So we saw that adding the enzyme at the start of fermentation and some of the dry hop also at the start of fermentation, we saw actually a decrease on total terpenes. We think that the reason for this could be that some of these dry hops, these 25% of the dry hops added at the very start of fermentation, that could be a loss of volatiles because of some of the interaction we discussed in the previous slides. I'm talking about the CO2 stripping or masking or adsorption. So this could be the explanation for the loss of these compounds here. And FB4, or the trial number 4, there was enzyme and 100% of the dry hops added at day 4 fermentation. And we can see by doing this combination, it was the highest content on terpenes. Okay. So I'm not presenting more data because we had different trials at global scale, as mentioned. But some of the conclusions we've got after all these trials is that it's not that 2 + 2 is equal 4. It's not that simple by transformation. It's really, really complex. We are at the point of trying to understand, I mean, not as Lallemand, but everyone in the world, researchers and so on, is doing research in that regards. So we're trying to define how to track and how to predict results on biotransformation. And as soon as we achieve this point, this will be super exciting because we will be able to predict and, let's say, decide if I use this hop variety at this point of addition by using this enzyme or by using this strain, we can find the sweet spot and release very interesting flavors. We also found that by using this enzyme, we know that it's making something in the beer. Still is not fully understood. As I mentioned from this research from Takoy, we think there is a theory there. So we think that geraniol it's reduced because it's turned into other compounds, but we actually don't know why is geraniol converting into linalool or is converting into citronol or why is doing this. So this is at this point very difficult to track. What is really encouraging is that when we use exogenous enzymes like aromazyme, we found that most of the consumers prefer enzyme treated beers, so that makes a clear preference. And that well, again, that's a positive thing. And so also we found by comparing the sensor results versus the analytical results, sometimes we see that it's not really matching. So some of the questions or open questions we have after this is that, are we looking at the right compounds? This is a really interesting question because we measure like 5 or 6 different hop oils. And currently we are also taking projects on thiols, but unfortunately I cannot provide any data at this point. But you have to bear in mind that a beer aroma or hoppy beer aroma is not described by geraniol, linalool, and citronol, and another one. It's described by hundreds or even thousands of compounds, not only hop oils, but esters and many, many, many volatiles. So it's kind of difficult to achieve a desired profile by selecting raw materials and so on. At least at this point, it's quite difficult to. Some of the initial goals for this project was to expect an increase on OHI. OHI stands for overall hop aroma intensity. So that was not the case. It's not like by using aromazyme, it's not you cannot expect like a punch in the face, but you really see a difference. So it's changing actually the profile, the hop profile. So that's why we can conclude that you can use less aromatic compounds for less aromatic hops, for more aromatic profile. And in that regards, there is some papers from, I think it's from Laurent Dagan, from Laurent Dagan, a researcher from France, who is an expert on thiols. So they were testing different hop varieties, and very interestingly, they found that cascade hops, they are not actually very rich on thiols, but they are super, super rich on precursors of thiols. And that means that if you use cascade in, let's say, in the mashing or even in the whirlpool, where you can extract by heat all of these terpenes, all of these precursors. So these precursors can be then modified and the thiols can be released and be free during fermentation. So this is something very interesting that is taking place at these days. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, by using exogenous enzymes, we found better mouthfeel, better drinkability, which was perceived positive, very positive by the consumers. And we found a reduction of not bitterness, but unpleasant harsh bitterness. By harsh bitterness, we mean this bitterness you achieve when you have higher pH in your beer, or even when you leave the dry hops for too long in the fermenter and you have all the extraction of vegetable material. We don't really understand the reaction, why it's happening, but we just found that it's really making a beer more smooth and more drinkable. So here I'm listing some of the main frequently asked questions in terms of aromazyme. So how does aromazyme work? Well, an aromazyme is an enzymatic preparation. It's not a pure enzyme, but it's rich in beta-glucosidase. And as I mentioned in the previous slides, beta-glucosidase is able to release terpenes, in that sense, monoterpene alcohols and glucose through an hydrolysis reaction during fermentation. Okay. It's important to mention here not to use aromazyme when the beer is prior to package, because you will have the release of this glucose, and anyone wants glucose in the final package, especially in beers that are not pasteurized or that contains live yeast cells, because this glucose will be consumed and transformed into CO2. The second FAQ is, will I have more intense and aromatic beer? As I mentioned, biotransformation is quite complex, so it's kind of difficult to track at this point. So it's kind of difficult to find the sweet spot, but it doesn't mean that you cannot find it. So we encourage brewers to test and try aromazyme in different hop varieties by using different hops and yeast strains. And we found, for instance, some breweries in Spain that they are using aromazyme quite often, because they actually found the sweet spot by selecting certain hop varieties and adding these hop varieties in certain points of the brewing process. So the third question will be, if I use super high aromatic hops, can I boost the aroma? Again, it's not expected an increase on overall hop aroma intensity, but we see a change of the spectrum of the hop oils. So that means that you can have an increase of aroma of less aromatic hops, but for high aromatic hops, where they have not a lot of precursors, but a lot of free forms of thiols or terpenes, then we can see a change in the spectrum. Okay. What if I use this kind of enzyme in lagers or sour beers? So, well, you can use it in lagers. So this enzyme is working from 15 up to 65, so it's quite stable at high temperature. So that means you can brew hoppy lagers. Okay. Of course, the enzyme activity at low level at 15 it will be super low. So the enzyme is working in less intensity. And if you use it at 65, which is not likely to happen in a fermenter, of course you will have a super high reaction. For those who tried Kveik strains, like Voss, let's say, it's a fermentation that is taking place at 40 degrees Celsius. So at 40 Celsius, you can use this enzyme where it will react quite heavily. So it's interesting to consider. And in the case of sour beers, including fruits, one point here, interesting point, is that fruits also contain glycosides. So that means they contain terpenes in a bound form. So it can be used with this sort of beer as well. It doesn't need to be in hops, but it can be used in fruity beers. It doesn't matter if it's sour beer, a low pH. So what about the application? As I mentioned, all the breweries, they use it in dry form. But of course, if you dry hydrate it, it's better for an even distribution or an even dispersion within the fermenter. But it's not really crucial, because when the fermentation is taking place, you see there is a lot of movements and turbulence within the fermenter. So the enzyme will be homogenized after all. What if I use aromazyme in less aromatic hops? So yeah, why not? So some hop varieties like Cascade, they are not as fancy as many others. but it's known that they contain a lot of precursors, especially on thiols and terpenes. So yeah, yes, why not? It can be used for such hops. We found good results by using Cascade, also with Chinook and Centennial. So good hop varieties to try with Aromazine. Some extra information regarding this exogenous enzyme. Well, it's in powder form, so that makes quite stable in time. So it has a shelf life of 4 years, which is quite long, and the stability is quite remarkable because it can be stored and transported at room temperature. So it can be stored also from 0 to 25 with no problem. In case you want to know more about biotransformation, because it's quite interesting but complex topic, you can find a really nice presentation in collaboration with Laurent Dagan from Niceos in France. So that was you can see the YouTube link here. That was a talk about the aroma potential of hops and malts, because malts also contain precursors with aromatic compounds. So something really interesting to have a look. And we also have a talk which is I believe it's in YouTube as well. You can see through our website. That was done in collaboration with Professor Thomas Schellhammer from Oregon State University in the United States, and in collaboration with Lallemand. So in that sense, it was a series of results of using Lallemand strains and Aromazine, and some interesting results at lab scale. So any information in that regards, please feel free to have a look in these videos. So I think that's all from my side. In case there is any question, please leave it in the chat. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. I see a question from Brian. He's asking, what are the advantages of glucose over sugar? Let me go back to the slide. So by sugar, I understand you mean sucrose, sorry. So sucrose is not actually playing a role in biotransformation. It's not found there, but glucose is. If I can find it, yeah, here it is. But it's not actually any advantage one over the other. But what we see here is that we release glucose thanks to this hydrolysis reaction. So this glucose is found chemically bound and found in a glycoside. So this molecule is found in the green matter of hops, in the leaves of hop pellets. So it's not that we add glucose or we add sucrose. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Brian. Okay, there's another question. When do you have to add aromazyme? We preferably like to use aromazyme at the very start of fermentation in order to allow the enzyme to do the work. Otherwise, you can use it also at mid fermentation. But as I pointed out before, never use it at the very end, because we don't want any glucose release in final or packaged beer. So you have a window that will go from the start at the mid fermentation. So the main point is to allow the enzyme to do the work and release on a daily basis the terpenes. There is another question next to this one which says, during my session or boil or whirlpool or when cooled, and how much will you have to use for a 30 liters vessel? So you could use aromazyme, for instance, in the mash because it stands up to 65 Celsius, but I'm not sure how the terpenes will be surviving during the after boiling conditions. I think it's worth to try, but again, some terpenes are more volatile than others, and there is a 60 minutes, at least 60 minutes boil after in the downstream process, so I'm not sure how they will survive. And for a 30 liters, so if we have 5 grams per 100 liters. So 30 will be, what will be? Let me do the calculations. So 500 hundreds. So you will need 1.5 grams, so a tiny amount. 1.5 grams per 30 liters. That's all. So there is another question here. Does the enzyme have an impact on attenuation slash hop creep? Yes, it does for attenuation, and it does not for hop creep. Why in attenuation? So again, coming back to this slide here, we see a slight over attenuation, but super slight because of the glucose release, which is converted into ethanol. But we don't expect aromazyme to degrade all these extra sugars from the very end of fermentation. So it doesn't have any amylolytic activity. It's not degrading. It's not like a diastatic, which is degrading the residual sugars. It's only fermenting sugars that are coming from hops. Okay, and I understand the question related to hop creep, but hop creep is a total different reaction that is happening there. So hop creep per se is the enzyme activity that is not coming from yeast, it's coming from the hops per se. And these enzymes found in hops are able to degrade and break down all the sugars from the final beer, all the residual sugars. So that's a total different reaction here. So it's actually not playing any role, aromazyme into hop creep. And another question here, when adding aromazyme during mash, more thiols can be reduced during fermentation. Not thiols, because aromazyme, it's a beta-glucosidase product. It's not beta-lyase. So thiols, as you can see, one of the thiols here for MSP, it's a total different story. It's two different types, excuse me, it's two different types of biotransformation. Okay, so aromazyme is only playing a role here. So it's not really releasing thiols. That you will need here a beta-lyase preparation and exogenous enzymes, or the use of a super high enzymatic strain like Verden. So I hope the question was answered. Excuse me. Yeah. Mhm. That's a excuse me. That's a really good question. Thank you. The good point here is that it's quite stable on time. So I have also homebrewers in Spain asking me the same question, and at this point we're not considering to make a product at smaller format. But for the homebrewers who are doing this request, I'm telling them to, if they are part of an association, homebrewing association or homebrewing clubs, to buy the product and they can split and they can use a scale by their own and measure 1.5 or even 2 grams for such small volumes. That will be the best. And then considering that it's in dry form and it has a shelf life of 4 years, so well, it's not an expensive product, which is good to mention also. You can use it anytime at your home. So that will be the best solution we have so far. I hope it makes sense.
We have no more questions from the audience.
That means all was clear. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the talk. I'm happy to provide the slides if anyone is interested. I don't know if this will be, I believe this is recorded, so you can check anytime. And I would like to thank you again for your participation in this talk, and thanks to you for all the support behind. It's really appreciated. So again, do your own fermentations using brewing strains or using also exogenous enzymes, and play with it because it's actually really exciting. Happy Saturday to everyone, and of course, happy brewing to everyone as well. Cheers. Thank you and goodbye.
Sorry.
Yep.
One
Oh,
last question
oh
from
yeah.
the chat here. Question is, are there any tests already with Belgian Abbey yeast and aromazine?
Yes, that's a actually a really good question. Not in the trials I was showing up before, um, but we had some customers using POF positive strains like Abbey, and we found something really interesting. Well, you know, this product, Aromazyme, is intended for hoppy beers. We don't promote it for other beer styles. But we found that by using Aromazyme, we saw an increase of phenolic flavors. So my main takeaway or my main reply from this question will be if you use Aromazyme with POF positive strains like Lallebrew AB, you will see or you can expect a lot of phenolic flavors. So it can really boost the phenolic compounds here.
Okay, thank you, Joan, for
Thank
your
you.
time. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for your questions.